in order to have the result that is possible, which means in order to experience the truth of yourself and the truth of reality, it's necessary to practice. And that practice is formal when it comes to meditation. You know, we practice it formally, which is the Zazen. But the purpose of the formal practice and the purpose of the teachings is to transform your experience of yourself in your life. So that purpose, in order to realize that purpose, formal meditation is not going to get the job done. So what has to happen is what you're practicing in formal meditation, if you practice it consistently enough and if you continue to develop deeper understandings of the teachings, if you take on the practice of contemplation, for example, which that's a word I haven't used much here. You know, Richard Rohr, I mentioned I was listening to him, and that's the word he uses more than meditation, is contemplation. So what you want to aim for, you know, George Gurdjieff said you have to have an aim. You have to have a sense of where you're going. You have to have a sense of what you're aiming for, so that you have a way to move. You have a way to move forward, and you can start to distinguish the path. Right? What's off the path, what's on the path, right? So you can manage the process as you continue, you know, in this process of learning and evolving and transforming and transcending. So the way you want to think about it is that the formal practice is a way of preparing yourself for the informal practice. The formal practice is a way of preparing yourself for having this become a way of being, not a practice. But to have it become a way of being, there has to be enough of a consistent practice and enough of an understanding that it's an easy transition to come out of formal practice and into informal practice. And when I say informal practice, what I'm meaning to say is that your life becomes the practice. Therefore, when you wake up in the morning, if your life becomes a practice, when you wake up in the morning, you begin your practice, right? So you don't just wake up anymore, you begin your practice. And what that means is, you know, when you come into the waking state, for most of us, that means the person is waking up, right? So when you come to the waking state, thoughts begin to occur, right? The thinking process starts to occur. And that thinking process is the person waking up. And so by virtue of habit, right, just by simple virtue of habit, when we wake up, we wake up. The person wakes up. So the thoughts, so the neural pattern that we have about this is that when thoughts occur in your mind, you wake up as the thinker of those thoughts, right? That's the person waking up. That's the ordinary way of waking up. If you're going to begin to practice and have your life be a practice, then when you wake up in the morning, you want to train yourself, and there's a lot of ways to do this, but you want to train yourself to remember who you really are when you come into the waking state. You know, you want to train yourself to remember who you really are, and you know that the thinking activity will begin, and that will be the person, and the habit is to identify with that, so that's what wakes up, right? But you can train yourself in such a way where when that occurs, you recognize it for what it is. You recognize, oh, that's the person thinking. And then you change the channel to, oh, instead of me being that person thinking, I am the awareness of the thought process. That's the channel change, right? Then you become the awareness, the same awareness that is aware of the body breathing when you practice meditation. Now it's the awareness of the thinking activity that is occurring automatically when the waking state occurs. And then, so that's the beginning of your practice. Now, just like when you practice formal meditation, if you train yourself to do that, the first part is to train yourself to do that, right? So you'll find yourself forgetting to remember when you wake up in the morning, right? So then you can do something like put a half a glass of water on the table next to you before you go to bed, and you say to yourself, when you look at that glass before you go to sleep, when I look at that glass in the morning, I'm going to remember who I am. So this is a way of tricking the mind. That's why this is called a practice, right? Because if it wasn't a practice and it was a matter of your failing or succeeding, none of us would be here, right? So you have to have that. You have to have the flexibility and the space of practicing, which means you can fail and you can succeed in the space of a practice. No judgments or evaluations, right? The practice itself is the practice. And the practice itself means that you're not going to do it every time. But your commitment is to do it. And so if you find yourself not remembering, then you go to, okay, what can I do? How can I trick myself to remember? And there's a lot of ways to do that. Another way to do it is to, set an alarm on your smartphone, right? And if you're savvy with your smartphone, you can set an alarm that it'll be a song that wakes you up, right? And you can pick a song that will remind you who you are when you wake up, right? So there's a lot of ways to do this, right? And then you'll find if you do that for a while, you'll find that you can keep doing it, but you don't have to keep doing it. Now you have a habit, right? So when you wake up, now you have a habit of remembering who you are. And then after you do that, as soon as you do that and you are lying in bed, and now I'm aware of the thought activity, and I'm looking at the content of it. And if you look at the content of it, you'll see the evidence for it being the ego that woke up, because the content will always be about what happened last night, what's going to happen today, what's going to happen this week, what's going to happen this year, when will I die, how bad do I feel this morning, right? Why, all that stuff, right? So, and then the other thing is, after you wake up, to see if you can stay tuned into the channel, right? Which you won't, right? Things will happen, they'll take your attention, and you'll get involved in your routines and all that other jazz, right? But nonetheless, again, as a practice, if you just make it your intention to keep coming back and noticing, the awareness, This is what in India, one of the more famous teachers said his guru told him to do. And the way his guru told him to do it is to remember the I am. Just keep remembering the I am, which the I am is a word that he's using for awareness. Just keep remembering the I am, That's the practice, right, throughout the day. And the more, and my experience of that is the more consistent you get at that, the more clear it will be for you what it's like to be in the center of the storm. The more consistent you are with that, the more access you have, and the more clear it is for you that you can be the center of the storm. So as you're going through the day, for example, if you're practicing this consistently and you watch the news, right? Which today, watching the news is watching the war. Right. So when you watch the news, it's an opportunity to practice, not just watch the news, right? Then the question is, can you be with that, right? Because if you remember what Hal was saying, the whole purpose of understanding being, right, practicing being, right, is because being is the center of the storm. Being is the silence, the stillness that can be with everything and anything, including a war. So that's the practice. You're practicing being God. You're practicing experiencing yourself as the awareness, right? And it's a thing where you have to just keep coming back. And what will happen, Richard Rohr, when I was listening to him last night, he led a contemplation practice, right? And when he was introducing the contemplate, if you know Richard Rohr, you probably heard the practice, be still and know I am God. He does a thing with that, right? But before he did that, he said, this business of silence and stillness, and Richard, he's in his 80s now, right? He said, this business of silence and stillness is my preference. he said, during my day now, I spend a lot of the time this way, just sitting in silence. And that happens naturally if you do these practices, because you begin to experience how wonderful it is to sit still and be silent. It transforms from, something that you're tolerating, right, in the beginning, and something that you're trying to deal with being still and being silent while all this mental activity is going on, and this physical activity is going on, and this emotional activity is going on, right? So in the beginning, it's like that, right? But as you stay with it, as you sit through it, as you stay with it, right, the mental activity and the physical activity start to slow down, start to calm down, and you start to experience what it's like to be conscious, to what it's like to be awareness that is more the awareness and less the noise through practice. More the awareness and less the noise through practice. Yeah, the way I understand it and the way I think it's safe to understand is mindfulness and meditation are the same. When you're being mindful, you're practicing meditation, because when you're being mindful, you're being aware. You're not identifying with the content of the mind, you're being the awareness of that content. That's mindfulness. Right? Being mindful means being awake. Being mindful means being conscious, being aware, noticing, seeing things as they are, being who you are. That's all mindful. That's all mindfulness. The word, it's not a good word. I don't think it's a good word, right? Because the mind, the way the mind is understood in these teachings is that's where a lot of the trouble happens. So to be mindful can be confusing for people. So to me, mindfulness is, the word mind is also used differently depending on who's teaching. Some teachers use the word mind to mean awareness, the big mind, right? The screen of awareness. They mean it that way. Other teachers mean the mind to be the mental activity, right, that occurs. So it's important to understand which way that it's being spoken of, right? So, but what I mean by mindfulness is conscious, aware, present. That's mindfulness, presence. And so as you go through the day, right, yeah, it is the same as practicing meditation in terms of focusing attention. When you practice formal meditation, you're focusing attention on the breath and the body versus the thought activity. If you extend the practice to be an informal practice you're doing all the time, you're focusing your attention on awareness, the I am, right, versus mental activity. So another way of saying the same thing is that the brain scientists tell us approximately 70% of the time, what the AA people call you're involved in stinky thinking, right? So at least 70% of the time, if you start to pay attention, you'll notice that about 70% of the time, you're being a neurotic person. And anything that you're doing consistently, you're practicing. So if you're being a neurotic person 70% of the time, you're practicing neurosis. You're practicing being neurotic. And people can become quite good at it. Right?
And they don't realize it though, right?
No.
A lot of people don't realize
No, because it's not, it's not considered neurosis. It's considered being a strong person, right? But the word neurotic is neural. Do you see that? The word neurotic is neural, right? Meaning that you're being neural. You're being your mind. You're being your neural patterns, right? That's neurosis. You're being your neural patterns, right? And so the idea in these practices is you want to start to reduce the amount of time you spend in the default state, right? You want to start to reduce that 70% and start bringing it down, right? So that you're more here, not there. You're more aware than you are being a person thinking. You're practicing being the awareness, not a physical body, not a person thinking. Now, the way to practice that is to pay attention. So, and that's, pay attention, that's the focus of attention, right? Pay attention, train yourself to notice when you're in the default state. As soon as you notice you're in the default state, you're out of default state. So that's the practice as you go through the day. As you go through the day, if you pay attention to the mental activity, you'll notice when you're in the default state, right? And when you notice you're in the default state, you shift your attention elsewhere. You come out of the default state. You get present. Doesn't matter to what. Doesn't matter to what. You know, I heard somebody talking about this where a person was saying that they were suffering from depression. This is common. You know, when you get into the meditation practices, it's very common for students of meditation to start to ask for guidance in regard to anxiety and depression, right? Because that's something that is part of what they don't want to continue to experience, right? So the thing about it is that you have to train yourself to notice, like I heard a guy talking about this and he was asking, it might have been with Rupert, he was asking about suffering from depression and being stuck in it and he can't, you know, and he was saying he was in the supermarket, right, shopping, and he was chronically depressed, seriously depressed, and it was everything he could do to just do it, to do what he had to do with the shopping, right? And he was suffering. He was in the supermarket suffering in depression. And the person interacting with him said, okay, so let's look at this. How would you apply mindfulness to that? How would you apply informal meditation to that? You're in the supermarket, you're feeling miserable, right? You're feeling depressed. You're struggling just to stay there and do what you got to do to get home, right? And the answer to the question is, if you've been practicing informal meditation, in that situation, you do the same thing as you do when you're practicing formal meditation. Here I am in the supermarket, right? Now, this is something that will come with practice and come with training in terms of your ability to even do this, right? But you have to begin somewhere and train yourself and have an aim. So you're in the supermarket, you're in this mental state, okay? Now, one of the things that is evident about this, if you start to really look at it, you're in this mental state, but you're not in the supermarket. You're not present in the supermarket. You're present to your brain. You're present to your mental state. You're present to the neurotic process that you're in. That's what you're present to, right? So if you want to come out of that, right, you have to get connected to reality. You have to get connected to what's happening. You have to get connected to the supermarket, right? So if you understand this and you're suffering from depression, what do? You start looking around. You start getting present. You start looking around. Look for a child to make eye contact with. Look for a dog to make eye contact with. Look for any face that's receptive and smiling to make contact with. Enjoy the colors, you know? In other words, what this person was saying to the person who was depressed, there's nothing going on. You're in the middle of a supermarket. You're in the middle of tons of food is what's going on, right? And a little kid in that same situation is having a great time, right? Because they're there in the supermarket. You're in your head about the past and the future and what you're afraid of. So you're living the fearful life when nothing is happening, okay? That's what the practice of mindfulness is. Be in the supermarket. And if you pay attention to the supermarket the way I just described it, you'll notice you're not depressed. You can't maintain a depression if you're present to the situation that you're immediately in, because there's nothing going on there that would cause the depression. And that's mostly the case for most people most of the time, especially for us, right? Because we're the aristocrats of the planet. Do you know that? You are the aristocrats of the planet. The lifestyle we live, the comforts that we have would be considered royalty not that long ago. And even on the planet now, we're the top of the heap in terms of how easy we have it, right? That means you have the opportunity to experience that there's nobody attacking you. There's no war on except in your head, right? There's no war on. So if you want to experience peace, spend some time where there's no war, which is probably wherever you are, right? But you can't experience that peace if you're at war in your mind about life and about yourself and about reality, right? Then you will continue to struggle, you will continue to suffer, and even if you're for peace, that will be a hypocritical peace that you are for. How can you be for peace when you don't experience any? If you don't experience peace, the only peace you know is a concept called peace, which is a good idea. It'll make me look good to have the peace sign sweatshirt, right? And, if you were a hippie like me back in the day, that whole thing about peace. But even back then, we didn't know what the hell we were talking about. Pass it the joint. Yeah, okay, peace, pass the joint. One of the things that Richard Rohr said that I was happy to hear is he said that the only way out of the trouble we find ourselves in, right, even as good Catholics or good religious people, is unless we can come out of dualistic thinking and start to think non-dualistically, we can't see any answers, because in a dualistic world, what's going on is coming from the way things look to people, right? So you have to deal with that duality and you have to come out of it. And what he's talking about, by the way, in terms of duality, right, is that you and I are separate from one another. That's dualistic, right? Non-dual means that I see myself when I look at you. That's non-dual. Can you see that it'd be a lot easier to get along that way? Yeah. And it's not something I have to force myself to do because it's the right thing. No, it's natural. The dualistic perception is a natural perception. So when you talk about, you say that what's disturbing my peace is outside of myself, right? That's dualistic. And from a dualistic perception, that's the way it appears. From a non-dual perception, it's not outside of yourself. Yes, in a dualistic state of mind, things occur that way. It really does look like my peace is being disturbed by what's outside of myself. But if you keep doing the work of understanding it from a non-dual perception, then you start to see it differently. You start to actually see it the way it is. You start to actually see it with more clarity. You start to actually see other people as you. And when you see other people as you, that takes care of it. That takes care of it. And again, it's, to deepen your understanding, to continue to practice, right? And to have faith. I'm not a big faith person, right? But when I was listening to Richard Rohr yesterday, I could understand what he was talking about, because he was saying the time comes when you have to accept that you can't know everything. And if the only way you can have faith, the only way you can accept reality is to know enough that you know what it is, that's never going to happen. But you can know enough to have faith in the difference. I think that's a good idea. You can't know what God knows, but you can know enough to have faith in the difference and stop worrying about that, right? And just worry about cleaning up your attic and your basement and cleaning out your heart and getting yourself clear so that you can flow with what's already God's expression. Flow with what's already God's expression.